I've always believed in the saying, it's the things we don't see coming that knock us off our feet. That was just a saying to me until the night I found out my wife was cheating. It started with one of those little, out-of-the-blue surprises. You know, the kind you look forward to as a bit of a break in routine. She had arranged a surprise dinner for us, a rare thing in our 15 years together, since it was usually me who'd do that. That night, she was particularly dressed up, looking stunning in a black dress and heels she hadn't worn in years. She had an air of excitement I hadn't seen in a long time, and for a moment, I thought maybe this was her way of reconnecting. Of course, I'd later find out it was all for herself. She told me we were going to her friend Laura's for dinner. Laura's house was maybe half an hour away, tucked down one of those dark, narrow backroads that always feel a bit unsettling to drive alone at night. The evening was rainy, thick fog hugging the road, giving everything that you're in a horror movie feel. We'd been on the road for about 20 minutes when Allison suddenly realized she'd forgotten to bring the wine she'd bought as a gift. I shrugged, willing to turn back, but she insisted we stop at a small store on the way. When we pulled up to one of those lonely, old convenience stores, she asked if I'd grab the wine for her. "It's a Merlot," she said, "not too sweet." Inside, the store had a cold, stale feel to it, half the shelves barren, the overhead lights flickering slightly. I was only in there for a few minutes, but when I came back out, the car was gone. I stood there in the rain, confused. The store clerk gave me a strange look from the counter, probably thinking I was some idiot who'd just been ditched. I called her, waited, and tried calling again. Just when I was about to give up, she picked up. "I thought I'd pick up Laura myself and save time," she said, her tone sharp, her voice blending with faint laughter in the background. Then she hung up. I'd love to say my gut reaction was anger or shock, but honestly, I was just bewildered. I waited, soaking in the rain, wondering why she'd ditch me in a random parking lot, and for what reason she'd decided to pick up Laura alone. I figured she'd come back, no big deal. But then 15 minutes turned to 30, and 30 became an hour. Finally, as I was on the edge of calling a cab, she pulled up, alone, like nothing had happened. "Sorry, took longer than expected," she said with this weird, distant smile. No explanation, no apology. The whole ride to Laura's was tense. I tried not to make a big deal out of it, thinking she'd explain on her own, but the silence between us started to feel like something heavy, something I couldn't brush off. Allison just drove, her eyes fixed on the road, hands a little too tight on the wheel. I decided to stay quiet and see if she'd say anything, but she kept her focus straight ahead. I felt like I was sitting next to a stranger. When we finally got to Laura's, Allison put on a smile like nothing was wrong, stepping out of the car and heading up the driveway, leaving me to follow. I kept thinking she'd pull me aside at some point, say, "Hey, sorry, it was a weird situation," or "I'll explain later." But instead, she started laughing and joking with Laura the second we walked in the door, throwing her arms around her like they hadn't seen each other in years. She didn't even look back at me. Dinner was set up in Laura's kitchen, just the three of us. Laura had prepared one of those complicated meals she was known for, some kind of stuffed pasta and a ton of side dishes that filled the table. She was talking about a new online business she was launching, and Allison was listening like it was the most interesting thing in the world. I didn't feel like eating much. I kept thinking about the strange car ride, the way she'd left me standing in that lot, waiting. After dinner, Allison excused herself to go to the bathroom, and Laura poured herself a glass of wine, settling back in her chair. She started talking about work, mentioning a recent project. "And then, out of nowhere," she said, "Allison's been a great help with everything. She and Evan really know how to make things happen." That name, Evan, hit me harder than I'd like to admit. I knew of him vaguely. He was one of her colleagues, the go-to guy for logistics or something. I'd heard her mention his name before in passing, like when she talked about a client meeting or a work event. But the way Laura said it, with a little too much emphasis, set something off in my head. I nodded and pretended to listen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I don't know what made me do it, but the second Allison came back into the room, I made up an excuse about feeling tired and wanting to get home early. She was taken aback, like she hadn't expected me to cut the night short, but she didn't argue. We thanked Laura, said our goodbyes, and headed out. She was quiet again in the car, like she was waiting for me to say something. I didn't know what to say. The silence grew heavy again on the drive home. I could feel her glancing over at me from time to time, like she was checking to see if I'd say something, but I just stared out the window. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know the truth or if I wanted to keep living in whatever version of reality we'd built. But the question kept nagging at me, who was Evan to her, really? When we got home, Allison headed straight to bed. I watched her disappear into the bedroom, then lingered in the hallway, not really knowing what I was supposed to do. I waited until she was asleep, the steady rhythm of her breathing filling the room. Then I got up, headed down to the kitchen, and poured myself a drink. I just sat there for a while, staring at the counter, trying to make sense of the strange feeling in my gut. In the morning, she was already up by the time I came downstairs. She acted like nothing was wrong, chatting about her plans for the day, asking if I wanted coffee. I nodded, still half asleep, watching her move around the kitchen like everything was normal. But there was a distance in her eyes, something I couldn't put my finger on. It felt like she was holding back, keeping something from me. Then it happened. A week later, maybe less. Allison told me she was going to a work retreat for a couple of days. She'd mentioned these trips before, usually in some boring location where her team was supposed to work on team-building exercises and plan their next big strategy. It wasn't the first time she'd gone away for a few days, so I didn't think much of it. I offered to drive her to the airport, but she insisted on taking an Uber. Said she didn't want to inconvenience me. I didn't realize until that night that something about the way she'd brushed off my offer didn't sit right with me. So I did what I'd never done before. I checked our shared calendar and found out there was no company retreat scheduled. Nothing. Her calendar was blank for the next 3 days. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. The first time, I thought maybe she'd lost signal or was in the middle of something, but the second time felt deliberate. She was ignoring me. I spent the rest of the night replaying every conversation we'd had, every strange little moment, piecing things together in my mind. The way she'd rushed off to the bathroom at Laura's house, the way she'd laughed when Laura mentioned Evan. I couldn't sleep, just sat there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The next morning, I called her again, but no answer. I checked her location on the family sharing app we'd set up a few years ago, but her location was off. I thought about driving to her office, asking if she'd really gone on this retreat, but I wasn't ready to confront her without proof. Part of me wanted to believe I was overthinking it, that there was some logical explanation for everything. But deep down, I knew better. On the third day, she called me around noon, her voice casual, as if nothing had happened. She said the retreat had gone well and that she'd be home in a few hours. I asked her how everything had gone, tried to act normal, but inside, I was a mess. When she finally got home, I watched her unpack her bag, taking out clothes I'd never seen before. She had this new perfume on, one I hadn't smelled before. She noticed me watching and made a joke about trying something new, but the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she'd planned it. I spent the next week watching her closely, taking in every detail, every tiny change in her behavior. She'd get these texts at odd hours, smile at her phone, then put it face down on the table. She'd laugh a little too much at things I didn't find funny, her eyes sparkling in a way they hadn't in a long time. But whenever I'd ask her what was so amusing, she'd brush me off, say it was just work. One night, a few days later, I couldn't take it anymore. She'd gone to bed early, and I stayed up, waiting until I was sure she was asleep. I took her phone off the nightstand, careful not to wake her. I don't know what I was looking for, maybe some hint, some clue that would explain everything. And then I saw it, a message from Evan, saved under some random name in her contacts. It was just a short message, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. Can't wait to see you again. Missing you already. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at those words. It was like the ground had been pulled out from under me. The life I thought I had, the marriage I trusted, none of it was real. I put the phone back on the nightstand, my hands shaking. I went downstairs, sat in the dark kitchen, trying to process it. I could hear her breathing upstairs, soft and steady, completely unaware that her world was about to come crashing down. I realized, in that moment, that there was no going back. The next morning, I decided I couldn't hold back any longer. I'd spent all night trying to come to terms with what I'd seen, but every time I replayed the message in my head, it only made me angrier. The fact that she could come home, sit at our table, look me in the eyes, and pretend like everything was normal, it was enough to make me sick. So, as soon as she came downstairs, I decided to start the conversation. "Allison, we need to talk," I said, keeping my tone steady. She turned to look at me, a little confused, maybe slightly on edge, but she shrugged it off. "Sure, what's up?" she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee, acting like she had all the time in the world. I watched her for a moment, wondering how someone could be so calm, so collected, when she was the one lying. I had to remind myself to breathe, to stay calm, even though every instinct was telling me to throw everything on the table right then and there. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I asked. "About where you were last weekend?" She froze, her hand gripping the coffee cup just a little too tightly. It was a small reaction, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew. She set the cup down and looked at me, trying to gauge what I might already know. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice suddenly cautious. I held her gaze, refusing to look away. "I'm not asking to start an argument, Allison. I just want to know the truth. You told me you were on a work retreat, but I checked your calendar, and there was no retreat scheduled. So I'll ask again, where were you?" She took a deep breath, her eyes shifting slightly, looking anywhere but at me. It was the first real crack in her composure, and I could tell she was trying to figure out how to spin this. She stayed quiet for a moment, like she was running through her options. "I don't understand why you're asking me this," she said finally. "I told you, it was just a work thing. Then why did you lie about it on your calendar? Why didn't you want me to know where you were?" I said, barely keeping my voice in check. She sighed, giving me this look like I was being unreasonable. "I didn't lie, Ben. I didn't think it was a big deal, so I didn't put it on the calendar. You know how it is with work. Things come up last minute." I could feel my patience slipping away. "Fine, then tell me why you turned off your location." "You never do that, Allison. Why would you do that if you were just at a work retreat?" That's when her whole demeanor shifted. Her face tightened, and her voice took on this defensive edge. "Are you seriously tracking me now? Since when do you monitor my location, Ben?" "I don't monitor you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we share locations in case of emergencies. You're the one who suggested it. So why would you turn it off?" She crossed her arms, glaring at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. "I turned it off because I didn't want you checking up on me." "Is that a crime?" "I needed some space, Ben. We've been married for how long now, and you're still keeping tabs on me like I'm some kid?" I could feel the anger building up inside me. "Don't turn this around on me, Allison. I'm not the one sneaking around and lying about where I am. I'm not the one hiding messages." Her face went pale for a second, but she recovered quickly. "Messages? What messages?" I reached into my pocket, pulled out her phone, and handed it to her. I saw the message from Evan. "Can't wait to see you again. Missing you already." "What's that about?" The color drained from her face, and she stared at the phone, her hand shaking just slightly. For a moment, she looked like she was going to deny it, to try and brush it off like it was nothing. But then she let out a long breath, and her shoulders slumped. "Okay, fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what you think, though." I felt a bitter laugh escape my throat. "Not what I think? You're joking, right? I read the message, Allison. Don't insult me by pretending it's something innocent." She set the phone down, running her hands through her hair, looking more frustrated than anything else. "Look, I'm sorry. I made a mistake, all right? It was just a stupid thing. It didn't mean anything." I could feel my hands clenching into fists. "Didn't mean anything? So what, you're just meeting up with him for fun? For work? Come on, Allison, I deserve more than this pathetic excuse." Her eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, I saw a different side of her, one that I hadn't seen in a long time. It's not like that. I don't owe you a play-by-play of my life, Ben. Things have been tense between us, and maybe I wanted a break. Maybe I wanted to feel something different for once. Feel something different? You think that justifies sneaking around and lying to my face? I snapped back. She looked away, her jaw clenched, and I could tell she was weighing her words carefully. Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. You know, you keep saying that, but it sounds pretty damn serious to me, I said, feeling the anger rising with every word. How long has this been going on? She let out a frustrated sigh. Does it even matter? It's done now. I'll end it, okay? Is that what you want to hear? I could feel my chest tightening, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. How long, Allison? Just answer the question. She hesitated, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. But then she spoke, her voice barely audible. A few months. A few months? I repeated, feeling like I'd just been punched in the gut. And you thought you could just keep this hidden? Just keep lying to me? She threw her hands up, looking exasperated. I didn't plan on it, all right? I didn't set out to hurt you. It just happened. I don't know what else you want me to say. I shook my head, barely able to process what I was hearing. I want the truth, Allison. I want to know why you thought this was okay. Why you thought you could just go behind my back like this and pretend everything was fine. She looked down, avoiding my gaze. I don't know, Ben. I don't have an answer for you. Things just got complicated. Complicated? I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. You mean you got bored with our life, so you went looking for something more exciting? Is that it? She didn't respond, just kept staring at the floor, her silence saying more than words ever could. I felt this wave of anger and betrayal washing over me, mixing with a kind of sadness I hadn't felt before. I thought I knew her, thought we were solid. But now I was looking at a woman who was practically a stranger to me. I couldn't stand to be in the same room with her anymore. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, needing space, needing air. I could hear her calling after me, but I ignored her, heading out the front door, slamming it behind me. I stood outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I felt like a fool, like an idiot who'd been living in some fantasy while she'd been off with someone else. I trusted her, believed in us, and she'd taken that and tossed it aside like it was nothing. After a while, I went back inside, trying to keep myself together. She was sitting on the couch, staring at the floor, her face pale, her expression a mixture of guilt and frustration. I walked over and sat across from her, feeling the anger simmering just below the surface. So what now? I asked, my voice tight. What do you plan to do? Because I'm not just going to pretend this didn't happen, Allison. She looked up, her eyes red, her voice shaking. I don't know, Ben. I never thought it would get to this point. I didn't think you'd find out. I laughed, a bitter sound that felt foreign in my own ears. Well, you miscalculated. So figure it out. Because I'm done. I can't live like this, constantly wondering if you're telling the truth, if you're actually where you say you are. She nodded slowly, as if she'd already accepted what I was saying. But there was no remorse, no real apology. Just a resigned look, like she'd already moved on, leaving me to pick up the pieces alone. And that, more than anything else, told me everything I needed to know. I got up, walked to the bedroom, and started packing a bag. I couldn't stay in the same house as her, not after everything that had come to light. She didn't try to stop me, didn't say anything as I walked out the door and drove away, leaving behind a life I thought was real, but it turned out to be nothing more than a lie. I left the house that night with no clear plan, but as I drove around town, my mind started racing. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd thought we'd built together, was now just another broken thing she'd carelessly tossed aside. The anger kept building until I knew I had to do something about it. I wasn't just going to sit back and let her get away with tearing apart our life without any consequences. I wasn't going to be the one left cleaning up her mess while she moved on with whoever she wanted. First, I thought about going to her office. It was late, but I knew that place like the back of my hand. I dropped her off there dozens of times for those long hours and emergency meetings. But showing up there would be impulsive, and I knew I needed a clear head to make any real impact. I wanted her to feel the way I felt, like the walls were closing in and there was nowhere to run. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear what I had to do. Allison had always been someone who valued her image, her reputation. She'd spent years building this facade of a perfect wife, a successful career woman, someone respected in our community. If I wanted her to pay, I'd have to go after the one thing that mattered most to her, her spotless image. I drove back to our neighborhood, parking a few streets away to clear my head. There was no way I was going to sleep that night anyway, not with everything I'd just found out. I knew that a couple of our mutual friends would be finishing up their own work shifts by now. So, I pulled out my phone and started texting a few of them, starting with Josh and Lauren, who had known Allison and me since college. They were good people, the kind who wouldn't take sides easily, but I wasn't planning to let them walk away without hearing the full truth. It was time to lay everything out. In each text, I didn't hold back. I told them how Allison had been sneaking around with Evan for months. I described the night she ditched me at the convenience store and all the lies she'd told about her work retreat. I sent screenshots of her messages with Evan, proof, raw and undeniable. I knew it was messy, but I didn't care. I was done covering for her, done pretending like our problems were just between the two of us. She'd chosen this path, and I was about to make sure everyone knew it. Almost instantly, my phone lit up with replies. Messages flooded in shock, disbelief, sympathy. Lauren even tried calling, but I let it go to voicemail. I didn't need to hear their voices right now, I just wanted them to know the truth. They all deserved to know exactly who Allison had turned into, and I wanted her to feel the backlash, to know that her actions had consequences. I stayed out all night, watching the messages pile up, each one a reminder that Allison's web of lies was unraveling, thread by thread. When I finally drove back to the house the next morning, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. She'd chosen to betray me, and now she'd pay the price in more ways than one. When I walked in, the house was silent. Allison was still asleep, or pretending to be. I knew she'd notice her phone blowing up with messages soon enough. And I didn't feel any need to wait around for the fallout. The next part of my plan involved something I knew would hit her where it hurt most, her career. Allison's company had strict policies about professional conduct, and an affair with a coworker was the kind of thing they'd take seriously. She might try to cover it up, spin it as some misunderstanding, but I was done protecting her from her own actions. I gathered up every piece of evidence I had, the texts, the message about her missing Evan, everything that painted a clear picture of her betrayal. I called her company's HR department, asking to speak with the head of HR directly. When the woman came on the line, I introduced myself and got straight to the point. "Look, I know this isn't easy to hear," I started, keeping my voice steady. "But my wife, Allison, has been having an inappropriate relationship with a coworker named Evan. I've got evidence, if you'd like to see it." There was a pause, then a sigh from the other end. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," she replied, her voice professional but firm. "We'll need to look into this, of course, but if you could provide the evidence you mentioned, that would be very helpful." I forwarded everything over, every text, every screenshot. I could almost feel the weight of it as I hit send, like I was finally unburdening myself from this toxic mess she'd dragged us into. HR assured me they'd investigate, and I could tell by the tone of her voice that Allison's spotless reputation at work was about to take a serious hit. Satisfied, I left the house for the day. I had to clear my head, maybe find a place to decompress, but it wasn't long before my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from my sister, Maggie. She'd gotten wind of what was going on, probably from one of our mutual friends, and she was furious on my behalf. I'd barely finished reading her first message when another one popped up from her. "Ben, you deserve better. Don't let her get away with this. Come stay with us if you need a place to crash." That was all the encouragement I needed. I grabbed a bag, threw in enough clothes to last me a few days, and walked out of the house without a word to Allison. I couldn't stand being there, surrounded by all the memories we'd built, now tainted by her betrayal. The drive to my sister's place was strangely calm. It felt like I'd finally taken control of something in my life, like I was finally doing what I should have done the moment I found out the truth. When I got there, Maggie hugged me, a fierce, angry hug that said everything words couldn't. She didn't ask too many questions, didn't press me to talk, and I was grateful for that. She just let me sit down with a beer in hand, silent but supportive. As I settled in, Maggie told me she'd already heard from a few people about what happened. Word was spreading fast. Apparently, Allison had been trying to do damage control, calling up our friends, trying to explain it all away as a misunderstanding. But from what Maggie told me, no one was buying it. They knew me, knew the kind of person I was, and they could see right through her lies. But it wasn't until I checked my email later that night that I saw the real blowback from my actions. There was a message from HR at her company, confirming that they'd begun an investigation. The message was formal, but there was no mistaking the underlying tone. Allison was going to have to answer for what she'd done, both to me and to her job. By the next morning, I'd received several messages from people who knew her at work, asking if everything they'd heard was true. Some expressed shock, some sympathy, and others couldn't believe that Allison, of all people, would do something like this. And every time I answered, every time I told them it was true, I felt a small sense of justice. A few days later, I heard from another friend who worked in HR. Allison had been called in for a meeting with her manager and the HR team, where they laid out everything I'd sent them. She was apparently blindsided, left fumbling for excuses, but from what I heard, they weren't buying any of it. I didn't know what would happen next, whether they'd fire her or just keep her under scrutiny, but it didn't matter. She was finally paying for what she'd done, and for once, I was the one in control. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a certain satisfaction watching it all unfold. She'd betrayed me, torn apart our life together, and I'd made sure there was a price for her actions. The look on her face when I'd last left the house, the messages flooding in from our friends, the investigation at her work, it was all a reminder that her actions had consequences, that she couldn't just walk away unscathed. But that satisfaction didn't last long. There was still a hole inside me, an emptiness that even the revenge couldn't fill. I'd thought that by exposing her, by making her pay, I'd feel better, maybe even whole again. But as the dust settled, as the messages slowed down and the calls became less frequent, I started to feel the weight of it all. Allison's life might be in shambles now, but so was mine. I'd lost my partner, my home, the life I thought we were building together. And while I didn't regret making her face the consequences of her actions, I couldn't escape the feeling that I'd lost a part of myself in the process. I spent the next few days at my sister's, trying to figure out what came next. The satisfaction of revenge had worn off, replaced by a dull ache that wouldn't go away. I'd done what I set out to do, made sure she wouldn't walk away unscathed, but now I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that felt foreign to me. And for the first time since it all began, I started to wonder if there was anything left worth saving. It was a week later when Allison finally reached out. She texted, asking if we could talk, said she wanted to explain things. I almost ignored it, but there was a part of me, some mix of anger and curiosity, that wanted to hear what she had to say. She asked to meet at a cafe not far from our house. I thought it was a strange choice, meeting in public, but maybe she thought it would keep things civil. Either way, I agreed. I arrived early, found a seat near the back where I could see everyone coming in. The place was half full, and I had enough time to watch her walk in, looking around as if she hadn't just spent the past week destroying everything we'd built. She saw me, gave a small, cautious smile, and walked over. She sat down across from me, avoiding eye contact, fiddling with the ring on her finger. It struck me then that she was still wearing it. Somehow, that felt more like an insult than anything she'd done so far. We sat there in silence for a minute. She was clearly working up the courage to speak, so I didn't bother trying to make it easy for her. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked up. "Ben, I'm sorry. I know I hurt you, and I know I've messed things up, badly." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Is that what you came here to say? That you're sorry?" Her face fell a little, but she nodded. "I know saying it doesn't fix anything. But I need you to know that I didn't mean for things to end up like this." "Right," I said, keeping my tone flat. Just like you didn't mean for me to find out. She flinched but didn't argue. I wasn't going to let her off easy. She turned my life upside down, made me question everything, and I wanted to see if she could look me in the eyes and justify it. She looked down at the table, as if searching for the right words. "Ben, I know I made mistakes," she said, her voice low. "But things between us, they hadn't been the same for a long time." I felt lost. I watched her, feeling the anger start to bubble up again. Lost? That's what you call this? And you think sneaking around with someone else was going to solve that? Her face twisted in frustration. I'm not saying it was the right thing to do. But I didn't know what else to do. You and we weren't talking. You barely looked at me anymore. I felt like I was just there, like a ghost in my own house. I shook my head, laughing bitterly. A ghost in your own house? You're saying this is my fault, that you did this because I barely looked at you? I didn't look at you because you were never there. Always working late, always too busy. I thought I was giving you space because you were stressed. Turns out, you were just finding every excuse you could to be anywhere but with me. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped, her face tightening. I could see she was struggling, maybe for the first time realizing that every word she said only dug her deeper into the hole she'd made. Ben, please, you have to understand, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't stop loving you. I don't know how things got so far out of control. I thought I could keep it separate, that it wouldn't affect us. Separate? I repeated, my voice rising slightly. Allison, you threw away everything. How can you sit here and say you thought it wouldn't affect us? You were willing to risk our entire life together for this. Don't tell me you thought it wouldn't come between us. She looked away, swallowing hard, her hands trembling slightly. I'm not trying to excuse what I did, Ben. I know it was wrong. But I didn't plan for this to happen. It just happened. I leaned forward, my voice hard. So that's it? It just happened? You're going to sit here and tell me that you risked everything because of something that just happened? She didn't answer. I watched her, waiting, but all I got was silence. Finally, she looked back at me, her eyes pleading. Ben, I know you're angry. I deserve that. But please, can we try to find a way to work through this? I felt a cold, empty sort of anger settle over me. I hadn't come here to patch things up, but I needed to say what I'd been holding back all week. Allison, I don't think you get it. This isn't something we can work through. You didn't make a mistake, you made a choice. Every time you went to him, every time you lied to me, that wasn't an accident. Those were choices. And I don't think I can live with someone who can look me in the eyes and lie like that. She went quiet again, staring at the table, her face pale. I could tell she hadn't expected this, hadn't expected me to be so finished. So, what do you want? She asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I want a divorce, Allison. I don't see any way around it. I can't go back to the way things were, pretending that none of this happened. I've spent too many nights wondering what I did wrong, what I missed. But now I realize it wasn't me. You made a choice, and now we both have to live with it. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face a mix of shock and something close to desperation. She started to say something, but then she stopped, her mouth closing, as if she knew that no words could fix this. She took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. Ben, I don't want to lose you. I shook my head, unable to feel anything but a numb sort of finality. You lost me the moment you chose him. I was willing to fight for us, to believe in us, but you decided we weren't worth that. Her face crumpled, and for the first time, she looked genuinely shaken, like she was seeing the real consequences of her actions. But I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy for her. Not after everything she'd put me through. She reached across the table, trying to take my hand, but I pulled back. Don't. You don't get to play the victim here, Allison. Her hand fell back to her lap, and she nodded, wiping away a tear that had fallen down her cheek. I didn't mean for it to end like this. I gave a bitter laugh. No one ever does. But that doesn't change the fact that it's over. We sat there in silence, the weight of everything hanging heavy between us. I could feel her watching me, waiting, hoping maybe I'd change my mind. But I knew there was no going back. After a long pause, I stood up, feeling strangely calm. I'll have my lawyer send over the papers. We can figure out the details from there. She nodded, her eyes downcast, barely holding back her tears. I understand. I walked away without looking back, leaving her sitting there, alone with her regrets. There was a finality to it, a kind of closure, but it didn't feel the way I thought it would. I'd said everything I needed to, had put everything on the table, but there was still a hollow emptiness inside me, a reminder of what we'd lost. When I got outside, the air was cold, biting, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of the decision I'd just made. I'd closed a chapter of my life, one I thought would be my forever. But as I stood there, I realized that, in a way, this was the first step toward something new, something that wasn't tainted by her betrayal. I wasn't sure where I'd go from here, but I knew one thing for certain: I was done living in the shadow of her lies. I was done pretending, done waiting for answers that would never come. This was my life now, and for the first time, it was mine alone. And as painful as that was, it was also freeing. In the weeks that followed, my life shifted into a strange mix of quiet and chaos. It felt like everything had been upended, yet on the outside, things looked just the same. I had moved into a small apartment closer to my sister Maggie's place. She and her husband helped me settle in, setting up the furniture and unpacking boxes. They did their best to make it feel like a fresh start, but every now and then I'd catch Maggie giving me these worried looks, like she was afraid I might break down at any second. At first, I felt numb, like I was going through life on autopilot. I'd go to work, do my job, come home, and sit alone in that quiet apartment, too drained to do much of anything. My friends kept reaching out, offering to meet up for drinks or dinner, but most of the time I couldn't bring myself to accept. The silence was easier to deal with. But that silence also forced me to confront things I'd been pushing aside. The anger, the betrayal, and the bitter questions that kept running through my mind. How had I let things get so far? Why didn't I see it coming? Had I missed signs, or had she really been that good at hiding it? And, most haunting of all, had our life ever been what I thought it was? The divorce process itself was surprisingly smooth. Allison didn't put up a fight, didn't contest any of the terms my lawyer had put together. She seemed resigned, defeated even, like she'd come to terms with the fallout of her choices. I'd expected her to fight for the house or to try to drag things out, but she didn't. A few brief exchanges with our lawyers, and it was over. We agreed to split our assets, divide what little remained of our shared life, and that was that. After the papers were signed, I felt a strange kind of relief, a release, like a weight I hadn't even realized was there had been lifted. It was official now, the end of our marriage. And yet, as I walked out of the lawyer's office, the finality of it hit me. There was no going back, no more what-ifs or possibilities. We'd spent years together, built a life, a history, and now it was reduced to signatures on paper. Over the next few months, I started to rebuild. I spent more time with friends, started going to the gym, even signed up for a few local classes, just to fill the time. The empty spaces Allison had left in my life felt massive at first, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to fill with new things, new habits. I stopped thinking about her every minute of the day. The anger began to fade, replaced by a quieter sense of acceptance. One night, a few months after the divorce, I ran into Josh, one of the friends I'd reached out to that night I left Allison. We ended up grabbing a drink together, and he asked me, "So, how's life on the other side? Do you feel any different?" I thought about it for a moment before I answered. I don't know. Sometimes I feel better, like I'm finally getting my life back. Other times, it just feels empty. Josh nodded, understanding. It'll get easier. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but it will. He was right. It did get easier, but not in the way I'd expected. It wasn't like I woke up one day and suddenly felt okay. It was more like I gradually stopped feeling the weight of it as heavily as I had before. The memories stopped haunting me, the anger stopped eating away at me. It was just life, moving forward, one step at a time. About 6 months after everything ended, I got a call from Allison. Seeing her name on my phone screen threw me off, and for a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. "Hi, Ben," she said, her voice tentative, almost hesitant. "I know this is probably not something you want to hear, but I wanted to reach out. I've been going to therapy, trying to figure things out, and I guess I just wanted to apologize. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to know that." I stayed silent, listening, waiting for her to finish. "I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why I did what I did, why I let things get so out of control," she continued. "And I know that none of this is an excuse. I hurt you in ways I can't ever take back. But I'm trying to work on myself, trying to figure out how to be a better person, I guess." I let out a slow breath, processing her words. Part of me wanted to hang up, to walk away from this conversation without looking back. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the good times, the life we'd shared, wanted to hear her out. "I appreciate that, Allison," I said finally. "But you know an apology doesn't change what happened." "I know," she said quietly. I didn't want you to think that I'd moved on without any regrets. I know I messed up, and I'm sorry for everything." There was a long silence between us, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, I spoke. "I hope you figure things out, Allison. I really do. But this is as far as I can go with you. I need to move on." "I understand," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Ben. For everything. I hope you find happiness." I hung up, feeling a strange sense of closure. That call didn't fix anything, didn't erase the hurt, but it did give me something I hadn't realized I needed, a chance to see that she was human too, flawed and struggling, just like me. And while it didn't excuse what she'd done, it did allow me to finally put it all to rest. After that, life continued. I started dating again, slowly at first, unsure of what I was looking for, or even if I was ready. I met people, some good, some not so good, but through it all, I started to find pieces of myself that I thought I'd lost. I realized that there was a part of me that had been waiting, almost hoping for Allison to come back, to fix what she'd broken. But as I moved forward, I saw that I didn't need her to make things right. I could do that on my own. One day, as I was sorting through some old boxes, I came across an album from our wedding. I hadn't looked at it in years, hadn't even thought about it since the divorce. I sat there for a moment, staring at the pictures of us smiling, laughing, full of hope for the future. I felt a pang of sadness, a reminder of what could have been, but it was a distant feeling, more like a memory than a wound. I closed the album, placed it back in the box, and set it aside. I didn't need those memories anymore. I was ready to let them go. In the end, I learned something I hadn't expected. I learned that moving on isn't about forgetting or erasing the past. It's about accepting it, facing it head on, and finding a way to build something new, something better. I'd spent so long blaming myself, wondering what I could have done differently, but now I saw that it wasn't about what I'd done or hadn't done. It was about the choices we both made, and the consequences that came from them. Allison and I had our time, our life together, but that chapter was closed now. I was finally ready to write the next one, whatever that might look like. So here I am, standing on my own, free from the weight of betrayal, from the shadows of the past. It's not always easy, and there are days when the memories come flooding back, but they don't hold the same power they once did. I'm building a new life, piece by piece, step by step, and for the first time, I feel a sense of peace, a sense of hope. I don't know what the future holds, but I know one thing, I'm ready for it.